You ever notice how the loudest men in the room are usually the ones who've never had to bury their friends? The comment drifted across the Marine Corps base cafeteria just after 0700, quiet enough to sound accidental, sharp enough to cut through the hum of conversation. A few heads turned. Most didn't. The breakfast rush inside Camp Pendleton's main chow hall rolled on beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, trays clattering against steel rails, coffee machines hissing, boots grinding across polished tile. Outside the long windows, a pair of CH-53 helicopters thundered low over the flight line, their rotor wash rattling the glass for half a second before fading into the gray coastal morning. Walter Graves sat alone near the back wall beside a faded vending machine that buzzed louder than the Marines around it. 82 years old, thin shoulders beneath an old denim jacket, white hair combed straight back, weathered hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup like he was warming them beside a winter fire. He looked ordinary in the way old combat veterans sometimes did after enough decades passed. Quiet, unremarkable, invisible. 3 young Marines occupied the nearby table, fresh high and tight haircuts, spotless camis, voices filled with the careless confidence of men too young to understand silence. One of them noticed the tattoo first when Walter rolled his sleeve slightly to adjust the cuff near his wrist. "No way," the Marine laughed. "Look at that thing." The others leaned closer. Ink faded almost blue with age curled across Walter's forearm in the shape of a serpent swallowing its own tail. Inside the circle sat a black 5-pointed star. The lines were crude, uneven, ancient. "Looks like a biker tattoo from a gas station outside Vegas," another Marine snorted. "Or prison ink," the third added. They laughed harder this time. Walter didn't react. He simply lifted the coffee cup and took a slow sip while staring out the window toward the distant runway. That calmness bothered them more than anger would have. One Marine nudged his friend and raised his phone slightly, pretending to check messages while recording video. "Hey, Grandpa," he called out. "What? Unit gives out tattoos like that? The circus division?" More laughter rolled across the table. Nearby conversations began slowing. Marines glanced over without fully turning their heads. They sensed the shift in the room the way soldiers always sense tension before it surfaced. Walter finally looked up. His pale blue eyes moved across the young men without hostility, without fear, just tired patience. "It's old," he said quietly. "That's all." The Marine with the phone smirked. "Yeah, we figured that out." Before Walter could answer, another voice entered from behind them. "What's going on over here?" Captain Ryan Mercer approached carrying a black coffee and a tablet tucked under one arm. 34 years old, broad shoulders, combat fit. His dress utilities looked sharp enough for a recruiting poster. Marines straightened automatically when they noticed him. Mercer stopped beside the table and glanced toward Walter with mild irritation, already assuming he understood the situation. "Sir," one Marine said with a grin, "we're trying to identify this elite special forces tattoo." A few nearby Marines chuckled. Mercer looked down at Walter's arm. His expression shifted into amusement almost immediately. "That's so," he said. "What is it supposed to be?" Walter lowered his sleeve calmly. "Nothing you'd recognize." The answer landed strangely. Too steady, too certain. Mercer crouched slightly beside the table now, studying the old man more carefully. "You'd be surprised what I recognize," he replied. "I've spent 15 years around Marine recon, Raiders, Joint Command units. Never seen that symbol before." Walter nodded once. "You weren't supposed to." The room grew quieter after that. Not silent yet, but close. Somewhere near the kitchen, silverware hit the floor with a loud metallic crack that made several Marines glance up instinctively. Walter returned to his coffee as if the conversation were already over. Captain Mercer stayed where he was, eyes fixed on the faded tattoo disappearing beneath the denim sleeve, and for the first time since walking into the cafeteria, his confidence slipped just slightly. Captain Ryan Mercer remained crouched beside the table, longer than he intended to. The laughter around him had faded, replaced by the uncomfortable shifting of Marines pretending not to watch. Walter Graves sat motionless beneath the cafeteria lights, steam curling slowly from his untouched coffee. There was something deeply unsettling about the old man's composure. Mercer had dealt with angry veterans before. Bitter veterans. Loud ones. Men who demanded recognition because they missed the version of themselves that once mattered. Walter Graves was none of those things. That was what bothered him. The captain straightened up slowly and folded his arms. You mind if I ask where you served? Walter glanced toward the windows again, where the gray Pacific fog drifted low across the runway beyond the base. A long time ago, he answered. One of the younger Marines laughed nervously. That narrows it down. Mercer did not smile this time. His eyes stayed fixed on the faded serpent tattoo beneath the rolled denim cuff. The symbol tugged at something buried deep in memory. Not recognition exactly. More like instinct. Like hearing a familiar sound through thick walls. Army? Mercer asked. Walter shook his head once. No, Marine Corps. Another pause. Something close to it. The answer irritated Mercer more than he expected. Around him, the cafeteria had grown quieter by degrees. Marines at nearby tables were pretending to focus on breakfast while listening to every word. The old vending machine buzzed steadily against the far wall. Somewhere near the serving line, a cook shouted an order that nobody answered. You always answer questions like that? Mercer asked. Walter took another sip of coffee. Only the ones worth answering. One of the younger Marines snorted under his breath. Guy talks like he is in a movie. The others chuckled softly, but even they sounded less certain now. Mercer noticed it too. The room's energy had changed. The confidence was draining out of the conversation one slow drop at a time. He looked down again toward Walter's forearm. Let me see the tattoo. Walter's eyes lifted carefully. Calm. Measuring. No, the directness of the answer landed harder than anyone expected. Mercer blinked once. Excuse me. You heard me. The captain felt heat rise slightly in his neck. He was used to instant compliance on base. Especially from civilians. Especially from elderly civilians sitting alone in a chow hall surrounded by active-duty Marines. Yet Walter Graves sat there without a trace of intimidation in his posture. Not defiant. Not aggressive. Just immovable. Mercer took one slow breath. You understand where you are, right? Walter nodded faintly. Better than most people here. A silence settled over the table after that. Heavy. Thick enough to feel. Near the back entrance, Sergeant Noah Hale had stopped walking entirely. He stood beside the coffee station, holding a tray in one hand, staring at Walter's partially hidden tattoo with growing unease. Hale had deployed twice before becoming an instructor at Pendleton. Afghanistan first. Syria second. Enough years around classified briefings and old command archives to recognize when something did not belong in normal conversation. The symbol on Walter's arm bothered him immediately. Not because he recognized it completely, because part of him almost did. Mercer noticed Hale lingering nearby. Something funny, Sergeant? Hale hesitated. No, sir. But his eyes drifted back toward the old tattoo again. Mercer followed the glance. You know what it means? Hale answered carefully. No, sir. He stopped himself. Walter watched the exchange quietly over the rim of his coffee cup. Hale lowered his voice. I think I might have seen something similar before. One of the Marines laughed again. What? In some conspiracy documentary. Hale ignored him completely. His attention remained fixed on Walter now. More specifically, on the black star inside the serpent circle. The faded lines. The rough homemade appearance. The kind of tattoo done without proper equipment. In bad conditions. Somewhere far away from normal military life. Mercer crossed his arms tighter. Where did you see it? Hale frowned slightly, searching his memory. Not on deployment. Somewhere else. Walter finally spoke again, his voice low and gravel rough. You should let it go, Sergeant. Hale looked at him immediately. Why? Walter's pale. Blue eyes held his for the first time. Because the men connected to that symbol were never supposed to come home. The words settled over the cafeteria like cold rain. Even the younger Marines who had been laughing moments earlier stopped smiling. Sergeant Noah Hale remained frozen beside the coffee station, his tray hanging loosely in one hand while his mind clawed through old memories he had not touched in years. Captain Mercer watched him carefully. What does that mean? He asked. Walter Graves lowered his eyes back to the coffee cup between his hands. Exactly what I said. Mercer stepped closer now, his boots scraping softly against the tile floor. You cannot drop something like that in the middle of a Marine base and expect people not to ask questions. Walter gave the smallest shrug. Most people stopped asking a long time ago. The old man's voice never rose, never sharpened. That calmness was becoming unbearable. Mercer had dealt with hostile men before, men trying to provoke authority. Walter Graves felt different. The old veteran was not resisting him. He was enduring him. That realization irritated the captain far more than open disrespect ever could. One of the younger Marines leaned back in his chair and forced out another laugh. "Come on, sir. This guy is probably making half of it up." Walter did not even glance at him. The Marine shifted uncomfortably anyway. Sergeant Hale finally set his tray down untouched. "Sir," he said carefully, "I really think we should leave this alone." Mercer turned toward him immediately. "Why?" Hale hesitated. He could already feel every Marine in the cafeteria listening. "Because I remember seeing something close to that symbol during a briefing at Quantico about retired personnel records." Mercer frowned. "What kind of records?" "Old Joint Operations archives." Hale rubbed his jaw slowly. Most of it was heavily redacted. Walter's weathered fingers tightened slightly around the coffee cup. It was the first visible tension anyone had seen from him all morning. Hale noticed it instantly. "You know what I am talking about, do not you?" Walter stared out toward the runway again. A transport aircraft rolled slowly across the distant tarmac beneath the gray morning haze, its engines rumbling low through the glass. "Some things were supposed to stay buried," Walter said quietly. Mercer folded his arms tighter. "That tattoo connected to black operations?" Walter did not answer. "Special reconnaissance?" Still nothing. "Marine raiders?" Walter finally looked back at him. "You keep trying to fit old ghosts into modern names, Captain." The words landed harder than Mercer expected. Before he could respond, one of the younger Marines at the table leaned forward with his phone still partially raised. "If it is all classified secret agent stuff," he joked, "how about proving it?" Walter's eyes drifted slowly toward the phone camera. The Marine suddenly looked less confident under that stare. "You should delete that recording," Walter said. Not threatening, not angry, just certain. The Marine smirked nervously. "Why?" Walter studied him for another long second. "Because there are still people alive who remember that symbol." Something about the way he said it caused the room to go completely still. No bravado, no drama, just quiet certainty spoken by a man too old to bluff. Sergeant Hale felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He suddenly remembered where he had seen the serpent symbol before. Not in a briefing presentation. In a photograph. Black and white. Grainy. 5 exhausted men standing beside a helicopter somewhere deep in jungle terrain. No names attached. No operation listed. Just a classification stamp and one handwritten note beneath the image. Survivors unknown. Hale looked back toward Walter with growing disbelief. The old man sat exactly the same way he had since morning chow began. Coffee in hand. Denim jacket half zipped. White hair silver beneath fluorescent lights. Yet the entire atmosphere around him had changed. Mercer noticed Hale's expression immediately. "Sergeant," he said slowly, "what did you remember?" Hale swallowed once. "I think that symbol belonged to a unit that officially never existed." One of the younger Marines scoffed quietly. "That is impossible." Hale did not take his eyes off Walter Graves. "No," he answered. "The impossible part is that one of them is apparently sitting in this cafeteria drinking coffee." The cafeteria remained unnaturally quiet after Sergeant Hale spoke. The usual morning noise of Camp Pendleton seemed distant now, muffled beneath the weight settling over the room. Even the younger Marines who had started the whole exchange no longer looked amused. One of them slowly lowered his phone beneath the table without being told. Captain Ryan Mercer kept his eyes locked on Walter Graves. "A unit that never existed?" he repeated carefully. Hale nodded once. "That is what I heard, sir." Mercer exhaled slowly through his nose. "You were telling me this old man was part of some classified ghost story?" Walter gave the faintest smile at that. Not amusement, more like exhaustion. "Stories get easier once the people involved are dead," he murmured. Hale stepped closer now, unable to stop himself. "Sir, were you attached to MSCVSOG?" Several Marines exchanged confused looks at the unfamiliar term. Walter's expression did not change, but something colder entered his eyes for half a second. "You know just enough to ask dangerous questions, Sergeant." Hale felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. He had spent years around Marines who projected confidence through volume and posture. Walter Graves did neither. The old man spoke softly, almost tiredly, yet every sentence landed with the weight of absolute certainty. Mercer noticed it too. He tried to regain control of the conversation. "Look," he said, straightening his shoulders. "If this is some old reconnaissance insignia, fine. But you are on an active Marine Corps installation surrounded by service members. People are going to ask questions. Walter nodded slightly. That is usually what gets people into trouble. One of the younger Marines forced out a nervous laugh. Come on, there is no way some secret unit tattoo is still classified after 60 years. Walter slowly turned toward him. You would be surprised what survives longer than men do. The Marine immediately fell silent. Outside the cafeteria windows, another helicopter crossed low over the base. The distant rotor noise rolled through the glass like approaching thunder. Walter's gaze drifted toward the sound automatically. Not casually, instinctively. Mercer noticed the movement. You still fly? Walter gave a dry shake of his head. Not anymore. But you used to. Walter stared toward the runway for several long seconds before answering. Sometimes. The answer should have sounded vague. Instead, it sounded careful, deliberate, like a man choosing every word with military precision even after 40 years. Hale could feel the tension tightening by the second. He looked again at the serpent tattoo partly hidden beneath Walter's sleeve. The faded black star at the center suddenly pulled another memory loose inside his head. A briefing room at Quantico. Dim projector light. An older intelligence officer stopping halfway through a classified presentation after one slide appeared too long on screen. Hale remembered seeing a similar symbol before the image vanished. He also remembered the reaction in the room. Immediate discomfort. Immediate silence. Hale swallowed hard. Sir, he said quietly toward Mercer. I think we need to contact command. One of the younger Marines looked stunned. Over a tattoo? Hale ignored him completely. Mercer frowned. You seriously believe this? I think somebody higher than us will know exactly who he is. Walter sighed softly at that, almost disappointed. That will only complicate your morning. Mercer folded his arms tighter. With all due respect, Mr. Graves, your morning already complicated itself. Walter glanced at him again. Calm. Unblinking. No, Captain. Yours did. The words hung there for a moment. Then one of the younger Marines made the mistake that changed everything. Trying to recover his pride in front of the room, he leaned forward and reached toward Walter's forearm with 2 fingers extended. Let me see this famous tattoo up close. The movement happened fast enough that nobody reacted immediately. Walter's weathered hand closed gently around the Marine's wrist before his fingers ever reached the faded symbol. No violence. No sudden aggression. Just precise speed that did not belong to an 82-year-old man. The entire cafeteria froze. Walter did not squeeze hard. He did not raise his voice. But the young Marine's face lost all color anyway. Walter looked directly into his eyes. I told you, he said quietly. You should not touch that symbol. The young Marine stopped breathing for a second. Not because Walter Graves had hurt him. The old man's grip was controlled, almost effortless, but there was something terrifying about the speed behind it. 82-year-old hands were not supposed to move like that. The cafeteria sat frozen beneath the pale fluorescent lights. No trays clattered. No conversations drifted through the room. Even the cooks near the kitchen doors had stopped moving. Walter slowly released the Marine's wrist and returned his hand to the coffee cup as if nothing unusual had happened. The Marine stumbled back half a step anyway, rubbing his arm with wide eyes. Captain Mercer stared at Walter in disbelief. How did you do that? Walter ignored the question completely. His gaze had drifted somewhere far away now, somewhere beyond the cafeteria walls and gray coastal fog outside the windows. For a brief moment, the old Marine base disappeared from his eyes entirely. The hiss of industrial coffee machines faded into another sound. Rotor blades. Heavy. Rhythmic. Beating against wet jungle air. Rain hammered against dark leaves beneath a black sky somewhere half a world away and 60 years in the past. Walter was young again. 19, maybe 20. Mud streaked across his face. Sweat soaking through fatigues, so worn they barely looked American anymore. The jungle smelled of diesel fuel, rainwater, and burned metal. A Huey helicopter crouched crooked in a clearing barely large enough to land in, its engine whining unevenly while steam drifted from the side panel. 3 exhausted men stood nearby holding rifles low against their chests, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the trees. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Nobody needed to. They had already lost 2 men crossing the border 3 nights earlier. The mission itself officially did not exist. Neither did they. Walter remembered kneeling beside another young Marine beneath the spinning rotor wash while a medic wrapped gauze around the man's shoulder. The Marine had dark hair, tired eyes, and a grin that somehow survived even there. "You know what happens if we make it home?" the Marine had asked over the thunder of the blades. Walter shook his head while tightening straps on a radio pack slick with rain. The Marine pulled out a small homemade needle and a tin cup filled with black ink mixed from burned powder residue. "Then we remember the ones who do not." One by one, the survivors marked themselves that night inside the vibrating belly of the helicopter while it lifted through heavy rain toward the South China Sea. No speeches, no ceremony, just exhausted young men carrying too many ghosts already. A serpent swallowing its own tail. A black star in the center. The symbol meant survival. It also meant silence. Walter remembered another voice after that. Older, colder. A senior officer standing beneath dim red cargo lights once they reached the carrier offshore. "Nobody asks where you were," the officer had said. "Nobody talks about Laos. Nobody talks about this unit. You go home and forget." But forgetting had never been possible. The memory dissolved slowly like smoke and wind. Walter blinked once, and the jungle vanished. He was back inside the cafeteria at Camp Pendleton with untouched coffee cooling between his hands. Captain Mercer still stood across from him. Sergeant Hale still watched with growing alarm. The younger Marines looked uncertain now, caught between embarrassment and fear. Walter flexed his weathered fingers once beneath the table. Old scars ached whenever rain approached. They always had. Outside, another helicopter rolled across the cloudy sky low enough to rattle the cafeteria windows again. Walter glanced toward the sound instinctively. Hale noticed it immediately. "You flew recon insertions," the sergeant whispered before he could stop himself. Walter did not answer directly. "Sometimes the pilots never even learned our names," he said quietly. Mercer looked between them both now, trying to hold on to authority that seemed to be slipping through his fingers by the second. "Enough of this," he said firmly. "I want identification." Walter reached slowly into the inside pocket of his denim jacket. Every Marine in the cafeteria watched the movement. He removed an old leather wallet cracked from age and years of use. Nothing about it looked impressive. No military polish. No dramatic reveal. Walter slid a faded identification card across the table toward Mercer. The captain picked it up carefully. Then his expression changed. Not shock yet. Something closer to confusion. The card carried no branch insignia. No rank. No official unit designation. Just a faded photograph of a much younger Walter Graves beside a classification stamp Mercer had only seen once before during advanced command briefings at Quantico. Top secret. Captain Ryan Mercer stared at the identification card for several long seconds without speaking. The cafeteria remained completely silent around him. Marines who had been joking 20 minutes earlier now watched like witnesses standing too close to something dangerous. The faded card looked older than some of the buildings on base. Its edges were cracked white from decades inside Walter Graves' leather wallet. There was no photograph seal from any modern branch database. No barcode. No digital strip. Just typed lettering beneath the faded image of a much younger man standing expressionless before a plain gray wall. Mercer's eyes locked onto the classification stamp again. Top secret. The words felt heavy in his hands. "This cannot be real," one of the younger Marines whispered under his breath. Mercer ignored him. His attention dropped lower toward a line near the bottom of the card. Access authorization, obsidian level. Even Sergeant Noah Hale felt his stomach tighten at that. He had never heard of obsidian level clearance before. Mercer looked up sharply at Walter. "Where did you get this?" Walter almost smiled at the question. "The government." Mercer's jaw tightened. "I am serious." "So am I." The captain took a slow breath and glanced toward Hale. "You ever seen anything like this?" Hale stepped closer carefully. The moment he saw the classification stamp, his expression darkened immediately. "No, sir," he admitted quietly. "But I know enough to say this is way above us." Walter sat calmly while they studied the card like archaeologists uncovering something buried too deep for daylight. He looked neither proud nor nervous. Just tired. That bothered Mercer more than anything else. Men lying about military service usually wanted attention. Walter Graves seemed to want the exact opposite. "You carried this for 60 years?" Mercer asked. Walter nodded faintly. Some habits survive longer than wars. One of the younger Marines shifted uneasily beside the table. "Sir, maybe we should call base security." Walter's pale blue eyes drifted toward him slowly. "That would create paperwork nobody wants." The Marine looked away first. Hale leaned closer toward Mercer and lowered his voice. Sir, if that clearance stamp is legitimate, we need command involved immediately. Mercer frowned. Over one old identification card. Hale kept his voice low. Sir, I think we are standing in front of someone whose records were buried on purpose. The words settled heavily in the air. Nearby Marines exchanged nervous glances now. The joking atmosphere from breakfast was completely gone. Outside the cafeteria windows, gray clouds rolled low across the coastline, while distant helicopters moved like shadows through morning fog. Walter reached for his coffee again with steady hands. You boys are making this far more complicated than it needs to be, he said quietly. Mercer looked back down at the card. You expect me to believe the Marine Corps forgot somebody with this level of clearance? Walter took a sip before answering. No, Captain. They remembered us very carefully. Hale noticed the change in Mercer's posture immediately. The captain was no longer treating Walter like an annoying, old civilian. He was trying to solve a problem now, one he did not fully understand. Mercer finally pulled out his phone. Who are you calling? One Marine asked quietly. Mercer never took his eyes off Walter Graves. Someone who can explain why an 82-year-old man is carrying a classified identification card into my cafeteria. Walter exhaled softly through his nose. Not frustration. Resignation. You should not do that. Mercer pressed the phone against his ear. And why is that? Walter looked toward the windows again, where another helicopter crossed low against the clouds. Because once certain people hear my name, he said quietly, your day is going to change. The line connected almost immediately. Operations desk, a sharp voice answered. Mercer straightened instinctively. This is Captain Ryan Mercer at Camp Pendleton. I need verification on an identification credential. Proceed. Mercer glanced once more at the faded card in his hand. Name is Walter Graves. Silence answered him for 2 full seconds. Then the voice changed completely. Repeat that name. Mercer frowned slightly. Walter Graves. More silence. Somewhere deep in the background, Mercer heard movement. A chair scraping hard across a floor. Another voice speaking quickly. Then the operator returned, suddenly tense. Captain Mercer, do not allow that individual to leave your location. Every Marine near the table heard the change in tone. Mercer's expression hardened. Who exactly is he? The operator hesitated. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lowered almost to a whisper. Sir, how close are you standing to him right now? Captain Mercer slowly lowered the phone from his ear, but he did not end the call. The operator on the other side was still speaking in hushed tones to someone nearby, voices overlapping with rising urgency. Mercer stared across the table at Walter Graves with an expression that no longer contained irritation. It contained uncertainty. The cafeteria remained frozen around them. Marines who had originally gathered for breakfast now stood quietly beside untouched trays, pretending not to stare while listening to every word. Walter sat exactly the same way he had since morning chow began. Denim jacket, white hair silver beneath fluorescent lights, coffee cooling in his weathered hands. He looked ordinary enough to disappear into any crowd in America. Yet somehow the entire room now felt built around him. Captain Mercer? The operator's voice snapped sharply through the phone speaker. Mercer blinked once. I am here. Listen carefully. You are not to involve military police. You are not to detain the individual. And under no circumstances are you to escalate the situation. Mercer frowned. Escalate what situation? Silence answered him for half a second. Then the operator lowered his voice further. Sir, authorization requests are already moving through the Pentagon. That sentence hit harder than Mercer expected. Beside him, Sergeant Noah Hale went pale. Pentagon, one of the younger Marines whispered quietly. Mercer ignored the comment. I still do not understand who this man is. The operator hesitated again. Neither do most people, Captain. Walter closed his eyes briefly at that, as though hearing an old familiar burden spoken aloud. Mercer noticed it immediately. You knew this would happen. Walter opened his eyes and looked toward him calmly. I warned you not to make the call. Hale stepped closer. Sir, maybe we should clear the room. Mercer glanced around the cafeteria. Dozens of Marines stood locked in tense silence now. Nobody was eating anymore. Even the television screens mounted near the ceiling seemed too loud. Mercer nodded once toward the younger Marines. Everybody back to your tables. Nobody moved immediately. Authority normally traveled fast through Marines. Fear traveled faster. Finally, the room stirred slowly back to life, though conversations remained low and nervous. Mercer stepped closer to Walter's table. "What exactly were you people?" Walter's gaze drifted toward the cafeteria windows where fog rolled low across the runway outside. "Disposable," he answered quietly. Hale felt another chill move through him. That unit operated across the Laos border, did it not? Walter looked at him carefully now. "You know more than you should, Sergeant." Hale swallowed once. "My uncle served in recon during Vietnam. He mentioned rumors about teams that crossed places nobody admitted existed." Walter gave a faint nod. "Rumors survive because the men usually do not." Before Hale could answer, the operator suddenly returned to the line. This time the voice sounded tighter. "Faster. Captain Mercer, stay where you are. Senior Command has been notified." Mercer frowned harder. "Senior Command meaning who?" The answer came immediately. "General Wallace Reed." The name landed like a shockwave. Several Marines nearby visibly stiffened. Even Mercer straightened unconsciously. General Reed commanded Marine operations across multiple installations on the West Coast. Men did not casually involve generals of that level over cafeteria disputes. Mercer lowered his voice instinctively. "The general himself?" "Yes, sir." Mercer glanced back at Walter again. The old man simply sighed and rubbed one thumb against the coffee cup lid. Not proud, not nervous, just tired in a way that looked older than age itself. "How long?" Mercer asked into the phone. "The general was already airborne before we finished the authorization check." That sentence drained the remaining color from Mercer's face. Hale looked stunned. "Airborne," the operator answered quietly. "Captain, the moment Walter Graves entered the federal database this morning, 3 separate dormant alert protocols activated." Every Marine within earshot went completely silent again. Mercer stared down at the old identification card still resting in his hand. Top secret. Obsidian level. Dormant alert protocols. None of it sounded real anymore. Yet Walter Graves remained seated calmly in front of him like a tired old man waiting for bad weather to pass. One of the younger Marines finally whispered the question nobody else dared ask. "What kind of Marine makes generals launch helicopters after 60 years? Walter looked toward the windows again, where distant rotor noise had begun rolling faintly through the cloudy morning air. Then he answered in the same quiet voice he had used all morning. The kind they tried very hard to erase. The sound reached the cafeteria before anyone saw the helicopter. A deep rhythmic thump rolled across Camp Pendleton like distant artillery, low enough to vibrate the windows and rattle the silverware stacked behind the serving line. Every Marine in the room recognized the sound instantly. Heavy transport rotor blades. Fast approach. Captain Ryan Mercer turned toward the windows alongside everyone else. Outside, gray coastal fog churned violently above the runway as a dark military helicopter swept low across the base. It did not slow near the command building. It did not angle toward the executive landing pad. It came directly toward the cafeteria complex. "No way," one Marine whispered under his breath. The helicopter descended hard onto the concrete service zone just outside the building, rotor wash exploding across parked vehicles and scattering loose paper through the damp morning air. Marines near the windows instinctively stepped back from the glass. Walter Graves did not even turn around. He simply closed his eyes briefly and took one slow breath through his nose like a man hearing an old familiar storm return. Sergeant Noah Hale stared outside in disbelief. "That is command transport." Captain Mercer already knew that. He recognized the tail markings immediately. General Wallace Reed's aircraft. The highest-ranking Marine officer on the West Coast did not personally respond to cafeteria incidents. Yet the helicopter engines outside were still spinning at full power. Through the swirling fog and rotor wash, several figures emerged wearing dress uniforms beneath heavy flight jackets. One of them moved faster than the others. Taller, broad-shouldered despite age. 4 stars glinting faintly beneath the gray morning sky. The cafeteria went completely silent again. Marines rose instinctively from tables all across the room. Chairs scraped sharply against tile. Nobody ordered them to stand. General Reed entered the building with the kind of presence that changed the temperature of a room before a single word was spoken. Conversations died instantly wherever he walked. 2 colonels followed close behind him along with a security aide carrying a classified folder tucked tightly against his chest. Mercer snapped to attention automatically. Every Marine in the cafeteria followed half a second later. At ease, General Reed said without looking at anyone. His eyes were already scanning the room, searching. Then he saw Walter Graves sitting quietly near the back wall beside the buzzing vending machine. Everything changed in the general's face at once. Not shock, recognition, deep and immediate. The older officer stopped walking entirely. For one long moment, nobody moved. Nobody even breathed loudly. Walter finally looked up from his coffee cup toward the approaching general. You got old too, Wallace. Several Marines visibly froze at the sentence. No one spoke casually to a four-star general. Not on a Marine base. Not in front of half the cafeteria. But General Reed did not react with anger. His expression tightened with something far heavier than authority. Regret. The general took 3 slow steps forward and stopped directly beside Walter's table. Then, in complete silence, Wallace Reed came to full attention. Every Marine in the cafeteria watched in stunned disbelief as one of the most powerful officers in the United States Marine Corps raised his hand in a sharp formal salute toward the old man in the denim jacket. Nobody in the room moved. Nobody understood what they were seeing. Walter stared at the salute for several seconds without expression. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Rotor blades thundered outside beyond the windows. Finally, Walter set his coffee cup down carefully onto the table. His old hands looked suddenly heavier than before. Tired. You should not have come personally, he said quietly. General Reed never lowered the salute. Sir, he answered, his voice rougher now. I should have come 50 years ago. The silence inside the cafeteria deepened into something almost sacred. Captain Mercer felt his pulse hammering against his ribs. Around him, Marines stood motionless beneath the pale lights, staring at the impossible scene unfolding only feet away. Sergeant Hale slowly looked down toward Walter's faded serpent tattoo again, then back toward the 4 stars on General Reed's collar. For the first time all morning, Hale realized the truth was even bigger than he imagined. Walter Graves had never been forgotten by the Marine Corps. He had been buried by it. General Wallace Reed slowly lowered his salute, but the weight of the moment remained hanging over the cafeteria like smoke after a storm. No Marine in the room moved. Captain Ryan Mercer stood perfectly rigid beside Walter Graves' table, his mind struggling to reconcile the quiet old man with the impossible scene unfolding in front of him. 4-star generals did not salute forgotten civilians in cafeterias. They especially did not arrive by helicopter within minutes of hearing a name. Yet every instinct Mercer possessed told him what he was witnessing was absolutely real. Walter looked up at Reed with tired eyes. You still travel too fast, he murmured. A faint smile touched the general's face for the first time. You taught us that hesitation gets people killed. The room stayed silent after that. Even the younger Marines who had mocked Walter earlier now looked physically uncomfortable beneath the fluorescent lights. One stared at the floor completely unable to meet the old veteran's eyes. General Reed finally glanced around the cafeteria at the gathered Marines. His expression hardened slightly. How many people here know what this man did for this country? Nobody answered. Reed nodded once as though expecting the silence. That is because most of what he did never officially happened. The general turned back toward Walter. You crossed borders nobody was supposed to cross. You brought teams home that Washington had already written off. You saved Marines whose families were preparing funeral notices while you were still carrying them through jungle terrain. Mercer felt the air leave his lungs slowly. Nearby Marines stood motionless, absorbing every word. Walter stared quietly at the table. No pride touched his expression, only old exhaustion. Reed continued softly now. The symbol on his arm belonged to a reconnaissance team, so classified their records remained sealed for decades after the war ended. 5 men carried that mark. The general paused briefly. Walter Graves is the last one still alive. The words settled over the cafeteria with crushing weight. Sergeant Noah Hale closed his eyes for a second. One of the younger Marines swallowed hard enough for the sound to carry through the silence. Walter finally looked up again. You should stop talking, Wallace. The general gave a small nod. Probably. Then he glanced toward the Marines gathered throughout the cafeteria. But these young men deserve to understand something. Reed stepped closer to Walter's table. Most heroes do not look impressive after 50 years. Time takes that away. Rank disappears. Muscles disappear. Records disappear. His eyes drifted briefly toward the faded serpent tattoo. But some men carry service in their bones long after the government buries the paperwork. Captain Mercer felt shame settle heavily into his chest. He replayed every sarcastic word from earlier that morning and suddenly heard them differently. Smaller. Younger. Walter noticed the expression immediately. Captain. Mercer looked up quickly. Sir. Walter almost smiled at the accidental response. You were doing your job. Mercer shook his head slowly. No, sir. I was judging somebody I did not understand. Walter studied him quietly for a moment. Then he nodded once. That is how history gets forgotten. Outside the cafeteria windows, the gray morning fog had finally begun lifting above the runway. Pale California sunlight pushed through the clouds in narrow streaks across the tarmac. The helicopter rotors outside slowed gradually toward silence. General Reed glanced toward the door. There is a car waiting to take you wherever you need to go. Walter looked mildly irritated by the idea. I drove myself. A few Marines almost smiled despite the tension. Reed gave a quiet laugh under his breath. Of course you did. Walter pushed himself slowly to his feet. Every Marine in the cafeteria instinctively straightened again as the old man adjusted the sleeve over the faded tattoo. The movement was small, careful, almost protective. Captain Mercer stepped aside immediately to clear a path. Walter paused beside him before leaving. One piece of advice, Captain. Mercer nodded quickly. Anything, sir. Walter looked around the silent cafeteria one final time. The loudest men are usually trying to prove they matter. His pale blue eyes shifted briefly toward the younger Marines standing frozen near the tables. The dangerous ones already know. Then Walter Graves walked quietly toward the exit beside General Wallace Reed, while an entire cafeteria full of United States Marines stood in complete silence and watched the ghost of a forgotten war disappear into the morning light.